In this lecture, I want to talk about the very dramatic shift in the middle of the 19th century, the second re-emergence of a very progressivist view, which we call evolutionism. Now, there had been roots, as I've talked about before, of evolutionism well before this, but it was really in the decade of the middle of the 19th century that it became famously propagated through the work of Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace and Herbert Spencer and others. And it was the theoretical shift which really continued for another 100 years or so and underpinned many of the social sciences for a long period. And it was really a revolution in thinking, which we can see from the reactions to it. So let me just mention the importance of this shift in a couple of disciplines. One is in archaeology, in the words of Glyn Daniel. Two things were necessary. First, an appreciation of the depth of the human past, and secondly, some system of relative chronology within that defined depth, which came from geology. And then, he says, the revolutionary theories of Boucher de Perthes, finally in 1859, interestingly the same year as the Origin of Species. The importance within anthropology was pointed out by Robert Lowy. He says a second reason for the slowness of the development of anthropology was, I quote, "until recently its time perspective was even more defective than its spatial vision. What vistas hitherto undreamed of were opened with the development of the Rosetta Stone and the Behustan inscription. Yet Champollion presented his discovery to the French Academy no earlier than 1822, and Rawlinson published an old Persian cuneiform in 1847. And these discoveries, startling as they were, carried on only to a few millennia before Christ. The real revolution came with the recognition of Boucher de Perthes. He, in 1838, and I may come back to this, submitted stone hatchets in proof of human craftsmanship in the Pleistocene period, but it made no impression, no one took any notice really, until 1858 to 9, where the views were accepted by Lyell and others. So this is the great change, and the story is so well known I'll only briefly refer to it, which is of Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin's first realization that the biblical chronology and the short time span of history and the constancy of species came about in the late 1830s and 40s, but he realized this was absolute dynamite. He noticed the savage reaction to the seminal work of Robert Chambers, Vestiges of Natural Creation, in 1844, and how that was absolutely torn to shreds by some of his friends like Huxley. And so he delayed and he worked in secret. And it was only finally when he received the paper from Wallace, which came to the same conclusion, that he realized he must publish or it'd be too late. And that was 1859. So Darwin was terrified of the consequences, and rightly so, because it really shook up everything: theology, philosophy, archaeology, anthropology, and was something to be trembled at, the possible effects of this new theory of evolution. Of course, it was part of the air at that time, and this is part of the background to a paradigm shift. It's not just one person who starts to see the world in a different way. I've already mentioned Alfred Russel Wallace, who came to the same conclusions in the same way, that is by reading Robert Malthus. And I mentioned Robert Chambers, another very important thinker who tends to be underrated. But it was a way of looking at things which also affected, as we'll see later, Karl Marx, and in sociology also the work of Herbert Spencer. Herbert Spencer, again, tends to be forgotten, but he was a really important player in this area, and he came to his ideas, which were very similar to Darwin's, in about the same period, in the 1850s. And indeed, he coined the phrase the survival of the fittest. And he gradually, not through Darwin, because Darwin hadn't published, but through observation, as Chambers had done, of geological finds, of anthropological findings, of all sorts of things, he came to the conclusion that species evolved. Here is just one quotation from his autobiography, which is very interesting indeed. And aged about 37, he writes, "On glancing over these stages, it is indeed observable that the advance towards a complete conception of evolution was itself a process of evolution. At first there was simply an unshaped belief in the development of living things, including in a vague way social development. The extension of von Bayer's formula expressing the development of each organism, first to one and then to another group of phenomena, until all were taken in as part of a whole, exemplified the process of integration. With advancing integration there went that advancing heterogeneity implied by inclusion of the several classes of inorganic phenomena and the several classes of superorganic phenomena in the same category with organic phenomena. And then the indefinite idea of progress passed into the definite idea of evolution, where there was recognized the essential nature of the change as a physically determined transformation conforming to ultimate laws of force. Not until setting down as above the successive stages of thought was I myself aware how naturally each stage had prepared the way for the next, and how each additional conclusion increased the mental proclivity towards further conclusions lying in the same direction. It now seems that there was an almost inevitable transition to that coherent body of beliefs which soon took place." So in his fascinating autobiography he describes how he came to his theories of evolution. For instance, just to give one tiny example from his autobiography, it was again population and the behavior of population which had been the key for both Darwin and this is a bit that needs to be redone. So it was population for Spencer, as it had been for Darwin and Wallace, which gave the key, the fact that populations built up, that the weaker ones, the least fit to a certain extent in one way or another, died off, that made the possibility of selection. So in a way Spencer almost got to the theory of natural selection, but not quite. For example, in 1852, the age of 31, he wrote, "From the beginning, pressure of population has been the proximate cause of progress." And again he wrote, "For as those prematurely carried off must, in the average of cases, be those in whom the power of self-preservation is the least, it unavoidably follows that those left behind to continue the race are those in whom the power of self-preservation is the greatest, are the elect of their generation. So this is social Darwinism. It's the survival of the fittest in the sense of being fit to survive. And it applies, he then goes on to explain why it applies to animals and to humans. So he has a theory of development, progress, evolutionism, and this continues until the publication in 1859 of Darwin's work. Now, if it was part of the whole air people breathed, so that the sociologists, different biologists, people like Chambers and others were thinking evolution even 10 years before Darwin's work, we're led to conclude again that it's a paradigm shift. And what could have caused it? Well, there were theoretical reasons. I will go over a few of them very quickly, and they're rather similar to the ones I've suggested for earlier developments in the idea of progress. In the theoretical and factual world of academic research, there were several huge changes in the first half of the 19th century. One was in geology, and although he was against evolution for a long time, Charles Lyell's work was very important. I quote Baker, "Lyell's demonstration of the great age of the earth prepared the way for the paleontologists' investigations into the antiquity of man, and these in turn contributed to the birth of Victorian social anthropology. Within the limited period of human existence calculated by orthodox chronologists, that is 6,400 years according to the biblical chronology up till it was shattered, the development of society from a savage to a civilized state was hardly credible. It couldn't have possibly happened in that very short period. But if you extend the history of man back 100,000 years or so, then you can begin to see some stages." The central work was Charles Lyell's Principles of Geology, published in 1830 to 33. And it was pretty favourably received because people didn't quite see the implications. He was a prominent, that is Lyell, against Darwin and Darwin's theories at the beginning, but he later changed his minds on the subject. The implications of his work, and he realized, was to undermine the biblical chronology, but this was masked over as much as possible. People like George Eliot and others began to doubt the biblical story, partly through reading Lyell and others. And yet, the geologists, Hugh Miller, Adam Sedgwick and others, tried to persist, shoving these huge time depths of the geology into the short time frame of the biblical account. This attempt to try and hold on to a paradigm, even though you've got big anomalies, is one of the fascinating things about the history of philosophical systems. We don't like to rethink everything from the base upwards, so what we try to do is tinker and just try and slot it in, force it in, and not change it, change the whole system. And as a result, one method is just to ignore anomalies for as long as you possibly can. A very famous example comes out of archaeology in this period, which I'll just give one example. In 1797, John Freer made observations in a gravel pit in Norfolk, which he set out in a letter. He set out his findings through a letter published in Archaeologia. They showed the presence of weapons in a layer, quote, even beyond that of the present world. Now, how could you have weapons beyond the present world? It's ridiculous. But no one took any notice of this letter. The same thing happened to Boucher de Perth, quote, who was really the key figure in the recognition of the antiquity of man, according to Gwyn Daniel. Writing in 1860, he recalled how nearly a quarter of a century ago, that is in 1836 to 40, I addressed you here on the antiquity of man and his probable contemporaneity with the great mammals. In other words, human beings had been there with these huge, now extinct species. He says this theory was rejected by science and also rejected by opinion. He describes how his theory was treated with disdain and slept peacefully until 1854. Then it was taken up by archaeologists like Sir John Evans and became a subject of great excitement and interest. This is 5 years before Darwin's publication. So it just sleeps, ignored, brushed to one side, and then suddenly something in the atmosphere changes and people start saying, I seem to remember something about that. Another sort of shift beyond archaeology and deep time depth was the shifting out of knowledge of space. There had been this dramatic change in the 18th century with Columbus and the discoveries and so on and so on. But in the 19th century, the penetration of European and, to a certain extent, American missions and voyages and governments into the world meant that there was much more known about, in detail, about other worlds and other peoples, which hadn't been anticipated in the Bible and was new knowledge and was shaking the foundations. For example, the founder of modern archaeology, Wursai, in a work in 1843, wrote, "At length attention was directed to the fact that even at the present day, in several of the islands of the South Seas and in other parts, there exist races of savages who, without knowing the use of metals, employ implements of stone, which have the same shape and adaptation as those which are discovered in the earth, in such adaptation, as those which are discovered in the earth in such quantities in Denmark. And further, it was shown in what manner those savages make use of such simple and apparently such useless implements." Gwyn Daniel comments, the extract quoted from Wursai is particularly important in that he shows how the existence of Stone Age communities in other parts of the world in the 19th century was an important factor in persuading himself and others of the possibility and indeed the actuality of a Stone Age in man's past. The effects of travel, exploration, in the famous example, of course, is Charles Darwin and the Beagle, but also Wallace in the Far East is another example. But another example is on the Charles Lyell himself. Early in 1827, Lyell determined to write a book that would introduce needed reforms into his geological science. Geological time would have to be substituted for theological time, and the continental tour began in 1828 with a visit to the Auvergne region, and then in Sicily he ascended Mount Etna, and he discovered as he travelled around all sorts of things that didn't fit in the chronology, just as Hugh Miller in the Highlands had discovered such things. And gradually the wealth of information about other parts of the world begins to shift the paradigm. So in one way you can think of Darwin, Wallace and the others as the creators of the evolutionary theories, but you could equally argue that they are the product of a shift in thinking towards evolutionism. Darwin was as much a product as a cause of evolutionism. I quote here Vogt's History of Anthropology. The second generation anthropologists, Fraser, Jevons and Marrett, were of one mind concerning this matter. Theories of social evolution were the children of the Darwinian revolution, but they overlooked the fact The developmentalist perspective was a feature of pre-Darwinian scientific speculation, that it was the dominant concept in the uniformitarian geology expounded by Lyell over 20 years prior to the publication of Darwin's great work. So it was a climate of opinion. What Darwin did was to provide, and I'm quoting here again from Vogt, provided substance for an evolutionary ranking of races by noting that differences in intellect and morality between the highest men, I quote, the highest men of the highest races and the lowest races are connected by the finest gradations. So you're beginning to get again a series of progressions. Darwin noted that how the uncivilized races succumbed to new diseases and failed to maintain their fertility. He says, when civilized nations came into contact with barbarians, the struggle is short, except where a deadly climate gives its aid to the native races. So it's a form of survival of the fittest. Races, in other words, come and go and disappear. Now, these are some of the theoretical backgrounds, geology, exploration, and so on, which stretch out time. They're underpinned by technological changes, which I'll go through very quickly because they're in some ways similar to the 18th century ones and earlier ones. One is the tools of communication, which in the 19th century, printing has been around for a long time, but the middle of the 19th century is important for the development of mass printing. Here again, Robert Chambers and his brother William were very important. One of the two earliest mass producers of information, papers for the people, Chambers' Encyclopedia, and so on. Mass education, which was spreading these new scientific ideas very rapidly around the population. Cheaper printing and the dissemination and absorption of this new information, both through printing and also through the enormous proliferation of clubs, of intellectual working men's, other kinds of clubs and places where these ideas were discussed. There were also other changes in communications which brought the world together into a much closer unity. One of them was the telegraph. The underwater cables across the channel were set up in 1851 and across the Atlantic in 1866. The press adopted telegraph in 1844. So the world begins to shrink. You can send information back and forth very quickly across from America, for instance. Another massive and terribly important as a background feature was the development of tools of destruction. During the 19th century, particularly from about the 1850s, the development of weaponry in the West again took another great leap. The Maxim gun, the machine guns, which mowed down resisting Chinese or Indians or anyone who came up against you, suddenly put the West in a huge advantage. So you had these technological advantages of weaponry, the Gatling gun as well, and armoured ships which could go all over the world and pound places which resisted Western power, which were byproducts of industrialization. The steam engines in the boats themselves, of course, immediately gave the West, as in the Second Opium War in China and elsewhere, a great advantage, and in India. So this, with the development of other technologies like railways, which opened up the prairies and many parts of India, and the power tools which made mass production possible, this gave a period of half a century or so of huge dominance to one part of the world alone. This was the period when Germany and France became industrial nations, and later America. And suddenly the balance between the world, China and India and the West, had been fairly balanced until the beginning of the 19th century, and then gradually it begins to tip, and then by the 1850s it's tipping hugely in favour of the West. Another was the agricultural revolution of the later 18th century, which expanded all over Europe and made European agriculture so productive. The effects of this are difficult for us to remember now, when the world is levelling out again. So I want to give it in the words of someone who is very partisan and partial and a very harsh critic of Western capitalism in the first half of the 20th century, Leonard Woolf. And he puts it very powerfully in several passages. I'll just read a couple of them. He says, in Asia and Africa, this exploitation and penetration took a peculiar form, which has made the imperialism of the 19th century a very different thing from the imperialism's conquests and clashes of civilizations in previous ages. The mechanical inventions in communication and transport put into the hands of Europeans the power of rapidly opening up distant and difficult countries for the purposes of industry and commerce. The same processes of invention and the new industry had also completely altered the balance of physical power in the world. Up to the 19th century, the civilizations of the different continents materially were not so widely separated as to give to one an overwhelming preponderance over the other. An Asiatic army could always make a fight of it with a European army, and the African could trust his poisoned arrows, his swamps and forests and mosquitoes to protect him against the European with a muzzle-loading gun and a bottle of gin and brandy. But suddenly all this was altered. The Asiatic, living and fighting as his ancestors lived and fought in the 12th century, found himself confronted with the modern rifle, the Maxim gun, the gunboat, and the light railway. I came across this just recently reading the memoir of a distant ancestor of mine, Robert Swinhoe, who was the translator on the Second Opium War against the Chinese. And it's a very sad, pathetic account of the Chinese riding up and down in front of the British, urging their soldiers forward, and then as they came forward, the British with their heavy guns and machine guns just mowing them down. And this happened in many parts of the world. So you get the rapid change. I'll give you two more passages from Woolf. There was a sudden, rapid and ruthless world conquest on a scale such as previously was unknown in human history. Between 1815 and 1914, practically the whole of the continents of Asia, Africa and Australia, with all the islands of the seven seas, was subjected directly or indirectly to the power of the European state. The subjection of Asiatic and African peoples to European states was sometimes direct, sometimes indirect. Direct subjection took place in Africa, which was partitioned, in India, Ceylon, Burma, the Malay Peninsula, parts of China, and considerable stretches of Asiatic territory was absorbed by Russia. In all these cases, the territory itself was annexed, usually by force, and incorporated within the European state as an imperial appendage. But there was also the rest of Asia outside Japan, an indirect process of subjection. Turkey, Persia, Afghanistan, Tibet and China all remained nominally independent and sovereign states, but in fact their sovereignty no longer existed and their independence was illusory. And he ends up, or I'll end up with a really bitter portrayal of what happened. In no other period of the world's history has there been such a vast revolution as this conquest of Asia and Africa by Europe in less than 100 years. Until very nearly the end of the 19th century, Europeans themselves regarded it with complacent pride as one of the chief blessings and glories of Western civilization. The white race of Europe, they held, was physically, mentally, and morally superior to all other races, and God, with infinite wisdom and goodness, had created it and developed it so that it might be ready during the reign of Queen Victoria in England to take over and manage the affairs of all the other peoples in the earth, and teach them to be, insofar as it was possible for natives and heathens, good Europeans and good Christians. Indeed, until the very end of the century, the natives and heathens themselves seemed to acquiesce in this view of the designs of Providence and the blessings of being ruled by Europeans. It's true that in almost every case, originally a considerable number of Africans and Asiatics had to be killed because the survivors were prepared to accept the dominion, or as it was often called, protection of a European state. But once the dominion was established, there were few revolts against European rule which could not be met with a punitive expedition. Now, he was very bitter, and he was for a time, a colonial servant. But the point is that the backdrop to the development of the modern social sciences, whether it's in sociology with Marx onwards, whether it's in the anthropology of the second half of the 19th century, is this huge imperial expansion. At the forefront, of course, were the British, and it's one of the reasons why, in many ways, social anthropology and anthropology, which was born out of this period, was invented to a considerable extent within the British Empire. It was the need to understand and document this rapidly advancing empire which led to the formation of anthropology and its dissemination in the universities and so on. It wasn't a direct link, but it was certainly a very important background feature. Vogt himself, in his History of Anthropology, writes that 19th century anthropologists, quote, declared their role to be the advocate of human advancement, of reason and of morality. However, acceptance of a biological social evolutionism reinforced an intellectual and racial elitism, despite anthropological concern with popular behavior as found in custom. So there was this push towards a certain elitism, towards a certain racism, which we now, of course, can see in perspective. Anthropology, as I'll explain in more detail, and some of the details are fairly horrifying to us, but you have to take them in the context of the period. A century later, it was easy for anthropologists to denigrate and to criticize this, and one sharp example of this is Edmund Leach's work, where he talks about the founder of anthropology to a certain extent in Cambridge, Sir James Fraser. Now, Fraser was a great anthropologist and a great thinker, but Leach is pretty sharp about him, and perhaps I'll quote Leach's article on Fraser and Malinowski. He says, for Fraser, science is the true association of cause and effect. Magic is the corresponding false association. Primitive man, being childish and ignorant, this is Leach, has much magic but little science. The modern European, being more adult and wise, has less magic and more science. For Fraser, all ritual is based in fallacy, either an erroneous belief in the magical power of men, or equally erroneous belief in the magical power of imaginary deities. The overall effect is to represent savages as stupid. They have the simple-minded ignorance of children, which is sharply contrasted with the sophisticated, highly trained mind of the rational Europeans. Europeans, too, have their childish moments, but in general the dichotomy is clear. The white man is wise, black, brown and yellow men are foolish. Fraser was writing precisely at the point when European colonial expansion had reached its peak. I think he's a little unkind to Fraser and overdoes it a bit, but there's obviously something in this. So the cause for the great transformation into the evolutionary phase of the next 100 years are massive technological, social. I haven't talked much about urbanism and the growth of cities and the growth of wealth more generally, and the Industrial Revolution. The massive outward expansion due to technological superiority, and the growing political inequalities between different parts of the globe. So you get the incorporation and more peoples of the world, and an attempt to try and understand and fit them into some kinds of chronology. And it reaches its peak in the middle of the 19th century. The great thinkers of that period, Lyell, Darwin, Huxley, Lubbock, who I'll be coming to next time, Galton, Tyler, great geniuses, but in their way all propagating this idea of a rapid growth of understanding, rationality, morality, and so on in the West as contrast to the rest. It's the peak of what's known as the Whig theory of history in Macaulay, although Macaulay's a bit earlier, and the idea in many Victorian historians of a progress of reason through history. So in many ways it's quite like the Enlightenment, in the idea that we are becoming more rational and enlightened, polished, urbane. The optimism is there, but it's more extreme, because in the 18th century the contrast was really between one very small part of the world, England basically, and Holland, and to a certain extent North America and the rest of the world. Now the whole of Europe, at least certainly the middle and northern parts of Europe, Germany, France, England, have had an industrial revolution. America is industrializing, and so you're getting an idea of real progress in wealth, in technology, in knowledge, in science, in chemistry, in all the different sciences, which puts one part of the world ahead of the other. And so we are progressing, and the effect of this on anthropology and other disciplines I'll discuss in my next talk.